Hi everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to be going over infant and toddler physical development. Some of the slides I will not be putting audios on just because they have imagery or they're self-explanatory and there's no additional points that I need to make with those. So just keep that in mind as you're moving along throughout the lecture that some slides may or may not have the little audio icon. And I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. First, we're going to start off by talking about some body changes within the first year of life. So we see that after birth, the birth weight doubles by month 4 and triples by a year. So we see that children gain roughly 2 to 3 inches and 5 to 7 pounds per year. And then by their third year, they're gaining about 5 pounds and 3.5 inches. Now keep in mind that this is dependent on whether or not a child has a low birth weight right after they're born. But we do see that on average, children weigh about 7 pounds and they're about 20 inches long at birth. And so there is a time-lapse video here that shows a child up to 2 years. And I would recommend looking at that just so you can get kind of an idea of what the body changes look like from birth to a year old. And notice that this is rapid growth within the first 2 years, especially when we see the proportions of the head changing compared to the body and the use of the legs. When we're looking at infant body changes over the first few years of life, we do look at the norms and the percentiles. So the norms are defined by standards of typical performance in children's development, and this can be measured at their weight, their length, their head circumference. We also do see that breastfeeding is used as a norm reference for standard growth. So whether or not a child is breastfeeding or if they are using formula, this can kind of also help us to gauge if a child is meeting certain standards for weight and length. And we also are looking at these numbers for average measurements, and individuals do vary, so there may be some variations within these numbers, and that's okay. We do notice that not everyone is going to be exactly at the percentage that we're looking at, and smaller babies do experience extra gain to be able to catch up to the norm. And really what we're seeing is that when you go to the doctors, you're checking on your child's growth and looking for any potential areas of concern within their growth patterns, such as do we see a growth that is happening steadily over time? And steady growth in the 50th percentile every year is important to note. Also making sure that children are in proper weight and length gains over time. And so you'll see here that there is imagery to show the percentile for weight and length. And so the percentile is just the number on the chart that indicates the ranking if the child is in the correct range for their age. And so we're again looking at height and weight, and there are different charts for boys and girls, and so we'll see the percentage ranging from 0 all the way to 100. And we also see that there are rapid changes based on eating patterns and sleeping patterns, and so the rate of increasing weight within the first few weeks of life makes a big difference because we're seeing that babies are being fed day and night repeatedly, and so just again making sure that we are having healthy, steady growth within our weight, length, head circumference for our children, and we can use charts that show and indicate that. On this slide, I've just put a little bit of information related to sleep, and so we know that newborns sleep a lot. It's very apparent. Your text talks about it more in depth if you want to check that out, but about 15 to 17 hours a day in 1 to 3 segments. So that's a lot of our day spent sleeping as a newborn. And we see that most of this time is spent in our dream state or our REM sleep, the rapid eye movement. So we're able to gauge based on our eye movement if we are in that pattern of deep sleep. And we see that our sleep patterns change as we get older. So we do have a increase in our REM sleep over time as we're getting older. We do also see that there are cultural differences within sleep patterns, so how infants go to sleep and where they're sleeping and where parents are within that sleep routine. And so I did include a great talk that kind of goes more into some of the different cultural aspects related to sleeping patterns. So I'd recommend checking that out a little bit. We also do have research to indicate that unsafe sleeping positions can lead to sudden infant death syndrome. And so some of the higher risks for sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, are specifically linked to having blankets or toys within the sleeping space, having pillows or other materials there, being placed on their stomach while sleeping, as well as bed sharing. So within the first year, it's extremely important to recognize if your space is set up for safe sleep and what that looks like. On the next couple slides, we're going to talk a little bit more about the brain. So let's first talk about neurons and neural connections. So in a baby's brain, there are billions of nerve cells in the central nervous system, and most of these are created before birth within pregnancy. And we see that communication begins within the central nervous system with the neurons. And again, there are billions of neurons in the infant brain, and each one has an axon and many dendrites. And so on the next slide, you'll be able to see an image of what that looks like and labels that go along with it. But on this slide, it's a computer-generated image to kind of show what those neurons, axons, and dendrites look like. And so you also can see here that many connections are potentially being made just with this one neuron, because there are millions and billions of electrochemical messages that are being sent to or from the brain, and thousands of neurons are being fired, and each synapse is to another neighboring neuron. So I kind of like to think of neural connections that are being made like houses with telephone wires that are connected from one house to another, and each of those neural connections is causing a transmission to be made, and within the first 2 years of life, the dendrites become more dense and more neural connections are made, and this is a process called synaptogenesis. We also do see, though, that later on, if there are neural connections that are not being used, so kind of that use it or lose it phrase, that we have a process called pruning happening. And basically this just means that when there are certain aspects of our neurons that are not being used, they start to get removed and allow space for more neurons to grow within the brain. Now, there are some aspects of genes and maturation that can influence this pruning process, but it mainly comes into play when we're thinking about experience. So potentially if there are adverse childhood experiences such as trauma, like abuse or neglect, this could increase and make the process of pruning more persistent and happen earlier on. So again, just keeping in mind that pruning is when unused dendrites, which are the connecting pieces, those start to kind of shed away and are no longer used. On this slide, you'll see information that goes more into parts of the neuron and what those neural connection aspects we were just talking about, such as dendrites and synapses, mean. And so you'll see that the axon is the long piece right here in the middle of the neuron, and on the outer layer of the axon is the myelin sheath. And I like to think of the axon, because it's an electrical impulse along the neural cell, I like to think of that as the wires within a telephone. And the myelin sheath is kind of like that covering piece that coats the outside of the wire so that they're safe and they have a protected layer so that this process of those neural connections gets sped up. And we see that the dendrites, which are those kind of finger-like pieces at the end of the neuron, that's the fiber that connects and receives all of those impulses, and they're transmitted from neuron to neuron. So those are kind of like the phone lines and the call centers for getting those signals. So they're receiving the signals and then they're able to transmit them onto other parts of the neurons within the brain. And so we see that there's this inner piece, so there's a connection called a synapse, and this is between the axon of one neuron and the dendrites of another. So if we were to have two of these images put side by side, we'd see that the axon terminal, which is at the bottom of this picture, would connect to the top of another dendrite. And so there's just lots of connecting pieces. And so I previously was mentioning that we might have those signals. If we're thinking of a telephone wire, we can think of it as different pieces of people's homes being connected with one another. So one axon terminal connects to the dendrite center. So the axon terminal is where the signals of the neurons are being sent out, and so there's that synapse, that space in between, and this is between that dendrite and the axon. So again, if you were to have two of those neurons put on the screen together, the bottom of one and the top of another would connect with one another. So kind of like a battery too, if you think about a battery connection, or the positive and negative motions of that battery, those chemical connections that are happening. And the neurotransmitter is just how this information carries from one axon to another, so that signal that's going through in between. And again, remember that during this process of synaptogenesis, we may see that pruning occurs if there are certain connections that are not being used. And we see that the addition of the myelin sheath, or that coding, is extremely apparent within the first few years of life, because that's when millions of connections are happening, so there's speedier transmission, and so we see that we have myelination throughout early childhood. On this slide, there's just a little bit of information related to some different parts of your brain. Your text goes into this in more detail, but just recognizing that different parts of the brain have different functions. So the brain stem helps to control automatic responses, such as breathing. We see that the midbrain impacts areas of emotions and memory. The cortex is the area where most of our thinking, feeling, and sensations occur. And then the prefrontal cortex is important for planning, problem solving, impulse control. So I did include a video here if you wanted to check it out, just for more information on remembering the different parts of the brain. This can be helpful as we're moving along and talking about areas such as thinking, feeling, emotional responses, and what area of the brain this is directly connected to. On this slide, there's just a little bit of information about the importance of experiences and how they shape brain development. I've also included a video that talks a little bit more about some of the aspects of the neurotransmitters, pruning, and how our experiences really do kind of make or break the opportunities for brain development to occur within the span of the first few years of life. So when we think about experience expectant brain function, we see that this is going to be expected opportunities for development or growth. So basic essentials for life. So we're thinking about water, shelter, food, clothing, examples of the environmental and genetic factors that are going to directly impact whether or not we can have survival within our life. Whereas experience-dependent brain function is going to be things that don't have to be required but can support the development of the brain. So for example, we see in different cultures and different families, there are many experiences that we may be provided that differ from one another. For example, we may be exposed to different environments in terms of where we live, different environments where we go to school, different kinds of parenting styles, and all of those are experience dependent because it depends on what's going to happen within that specific experience. And so we see that human beings can be extremely different from one another because we have different kinds of experiences that shape us. This also plays into the aspect of pruning. So depending on these different experience dependent opportunities that we may or may not have, there may or may not be more opportunities for success in skills later on for music, or skills related to mathematics, or skills related to creativity. So it depends on the experiences that we're provided with early on exposure in our lives. We do see that there are some aspects of harm within the infant brain that can occur in different areas. So the first one is thinking about lack of stimulation, and so this can include opportunities for play, allowing opportunities for varying sensations, so opportunities for touch and smell and taste. And so we're considering that these are experience dependent and experience expectant opportunities. So we know that infants and young children need opportunities to be actively engaged in their environment. They need opportunities for feeding and for connections with their caregivers. However, this could be something that is not provided, and so this can then decrease those neural connections in areas where we see attachment being formed. We also see that stress on the brain can increase our stress hormones, and then this can then increase later damages to brain functioning related to memory, related to problem solving, related to abilities to make social connections later on. We also see with social connections that severe social deprivation impacts human beings as well as other living species. And so we see that social connection is extremely important for mammals of all kinds, and that social isolation can actually harm the brain, and this can lead to areas of concern related to language, related to areas of empathy, as well as being able to feel competent and confident within our space around other people. And so having social deprivation then can lead to an inability to form social connections and have healthy relationships. We do also see that things such as an intervention in how we are treating a child's body, such as if shaken baby syndrome occurs, which is when we see that a child is shaken and abusive head trauma occurs, and so there's a brain injury that may then lead to permanent damage of a ruptured blood vessel within the brain. And so depending on the severity of how long or how forcefully a child is shaken back and forth, there can be life-threatening and also death can occur from this. And so there is a range of what might occur during these harming areas to the infant brain, but we can see that lack of stimulation, stress on the brain, social deprivation, and intervention where we are harming the body of a child can alter the chemistry within their brains and have severe, long-lasting impacts throughout the rest of their lives. Now we're going to kind of segue into development related to our senses, and so thinking about all areas of our sensory development. So sensory development typically precedes intellectual and motor development, and so we're considering our sensations or responses to sensory systems are detected when a stimulus is around, so our ears, our eyes, our skin, our tongue, our nose, all of our different senses that are evoked when a stimulus is present. So first, let's talk about perception. So these are mental processing abilities of sensory information when we interpret a sensation that occurs. And so this comes into place following a sensation. And so sensations, they facilitate social interactions and comfort. And we actually see that by 6 months, infants are able to coordinate their senses. And so we do see that their brain is able to recognize different social experiences and perceptions within those experiences that occur. So we see that they have the ability to take in auditory and visual content and stimuli within the world. So hearing certain sounds, seeing certain aspects within the environment, and also being able to perceive what is going on in the world around them. And so on the next slide, you'll see a little bit of information related to what that looks like. You'll see on this slide that I've included perceptual skills for children of 8 months, 18 months, and 36 months. And from now on, you're going to be seeing within our early childhood lectures different milestone markers, and these are being pulled from the California Learning Foundations. And so I do have a lecture that is present on Canvas where you can go and look and see where that information is found. So anytime you see that I've included month markers for milestones with different kinds of skill sets, this is where that information is being pulled from. On this slide, I also have included a video that explains the visual that's on this slide. And so this is focused again on perceptual skills. So looking at 18-month-old children and how they stop when they get to reaching the edge. And so this is an experiment that looks at children who are going over a platform, and they're basically able to stop themselves and recognize based on their perception that there is a potential danger within their view. Even though they cannot see it, they have a perception of there could be something there present. We also see that children are able to track objects around 8 months using their eyes and mouth, and then around 36 months we see that they can start to identify objects by touch, which we'll get into when we talk a little bit more about reflexes as well as motor skills. On this slide, just a little bit of information about sensations: seeing, hearing, taste, and smell. So seeing is the lowest maturity sensation at birth, and visual acuity is extremely poor at birth for infants with 20 to 200 vision, which basically means that at birth they're almost considered legally blind, so they're not able to see from a far distance at all. And typically their focus is between 4 and 30 inches away. And we see that through experience and maturation, this aspect of seeing increases. So their cortex improves, their visual cortex, shape recognition improves, as well as their ability to visually scan and see details of facial recognition, as well as different aspects of the color spectrum. We also see that they have binocular vision around 3 months old, so this is where they're able to utilize both of their eyes to focus on coordinating one image at a time. So consider putting, binoculars on and utilizing both of your eyes for that. We do see that 90% of tracking at birth occurs, and by 3 months, this is about 182% accuracy for tracking. And we do see that birth scans can show that around 2 to 3 months, there is scanning of facial features, so that facial recognition occurs within infancy. And so this is where we can see that formations of attachment do matter in terms of other sensations beyond just touch and seeing, hearing, taste, and smell. Also, our preferences for that, and that we see infants do prefer faces, curved lines, contrast, and circles, and their depth perception develops over the first few months. And then with hearing, we see that this develops during the last trimester of pregnancy. And so this is when we can start to hear the mother's voice, which we talked about. We also see that this is the most advanced aspect of a newborn sensations, and that we can see that there is sound that can be localized around 4 to 6 months, and they can start to discriminate different sounds, preferably right at birth, but within the first 3 months. And again, this is dependent on their experiences. So if there are new people within their environments within the first 3 months, we'll see differentiation in their discrimination of those different sound patterns and different tones and pitches. We also see that infants prefer human speech and their own home language, and slow rise time, as well as high pitch and exaggerated contrast. So we see that they prefer higher pitch voices as well as exaggerated contrast. So again, slow rise time, high pitch volume, exaggeration. So very prominent in how we're speaking, as well again as in our own languages. And then we see for smell and taste, that this is a rapid function at birth, and this is prominent within our social context of our world. So our experiences are also an important factor within what we have preference for smell and taste wise. And so depending on the kinds of foods that we're eating, the foods that we're exposed to, this is going to give us preferential taste and smell. On this slide, we have some information about reflexes. So keep in mind that the first movements are not skills quite yet, but reflexes. So these are involuntary responses to particular stimuli within the infant's environment in order for survival and to help them to exist in their new environments. And so the first one is the Babinski reflex. And so this one is where a newborn's feet are stroked and the toes start to fan upward and out. And we see that this is a reflex that is used in testing to make sure that the cerebral cortex within the infant is working properly and their brainstem and spinal cord are functioning. So all of those areas where those neural synaptic connections are happening, this is an area directly connected to motor functioning. And so being able to see that this fan word pointing of the toes is happening is important to recognize to ensure that proper motor functioning can occur at a later point in time when we begin to start grasping onto objects, utilizing our toes for walking and things like that. Same with the stepping reflex. This one is also important for later motor development. So looking at instincts to be able to be held upright when touching a flat surface and kind of moving their legs and feet as if they are walking while being held up, of course, by an adult. And so this is an instinct in putting your child in a position where they're going to have the basic format of walking, but they're just not quite there yet. And so this is a reflex that indicates that there is, again, proper connections being made for walking and crawling and movement within the legs and the lower part of the body. The swimming reflex is one where children have their bodies horizontally on their stomachs and they're stretched out with their arms and legs. And so this one can be supportive, again, of survival. So if they were placed into the water, being able to move away from danger, helping with breathing, protecting their airways if they're submerged for a longer period of time, and knowing how to maneuver their bodies in a swimming motion. The palmar grasp reflex is the one that you can see here on the top image. So being able to grasp onto something tightly, again, a reflex that is supportive of motor functioning. So being able to grasp onto objects involuntarily and then later for voluntary movement. And so that pattern lays the foundation for abilities to grab onto objects later on. This also is supportive of the bond between the infant and the adult present. And then we also see that the moral reflex is one for attachment as well as survival as well. So being able to cling on to the mother is the initial involuntary response with this reflex. So when an infant feels that they are falling or placed on a table, for example, lying down, they start to fling their arms and bodies up and kind of curl into their chests. And so this is also in response with the physiological crying as well as eyes being wide open. So trying to regain grasp onto the nearest caregiver in this moment. On this slide, you'll see a little bit of information related to gross motor skills. So gross motor skills are something that we'll talk about for infants and toddlers as well as in the early childhood lectures. And remember, I mentioned that I pulled information from the 8, 18 months, and 36 months from the California Learning Foundations. So make sure if you need more in-depth information from that you take a peek at those lecture slides on Canvas. So we do see that gross motor skills are movement of our large body parts, and so this can come into play when we're thinking about rolling over, crawling, walking, throwing, kicking, being able to pull to a stand. So some of those initial reflexes are directly connected to our gross motor and fine motor skills. We also do see that reflexes are the skills that become practiced and encouraged over time. So for example, that stepping reflex is one that we are often utilizing with our babies many times over, and this is supportive of their gross motor skills of walkers and crawlers. And we also see that this aspect of gross motor skills is that cephalocaudal and messing that one up, proximodistal, so the head down and the center out direction is important to consider for our gross motor skills. So we're working on building our abilities with balance as well as being able to move those large muscles within our bodies. So our arms, our legs, our torso is connected for gross motor movement. And so For 8 months, the ability to pull forward during tummy time. That requires a lot of head strength as well as upper body and torso movements. Our shoulders are required for that, so lots of strength is needed to support our body during this time frame. Active outdoor play is strongly connected to increased gross motor skills. We do see other skills around, the 6 to 9 month mark of being able to roll back onto our stomachs, move from hands to knees positions, being able to sit without support. At around 18 months, we do see that pulling to a stand using support. So this could be, with a walker or even the couch back or some other form of a chair. We also see that around 1.5 years, children can push a stroller on their own. They can start to sit down from standing positions, so being able to start in a standing position and sit down, so that takes a lot of knee and upper thigh strength as well as that torso control. Again, we do see that around 2 years, so that 36-month marker is when we're starting to see drastic changes from moving from a crawling and walking with support position to a running and walking all on our own, being able to kick and throw a ball, catching with both arms, being able to use a tricycle, jumping into a puddle or off the bottom of a step. So we've increased greatly in our ability to walk and run and utilize different positions and changes with that. And last but not least, just a little bit about fine motor skills. So these are the opposite motor skills to our gross motor when we're using our small body movements, so our hands and our fingers to manipulate objects. We also see that our toes are part of our fine motor skills. And fun fact, actually, bladder control is a fine motor skill. So that is a skill that comes in time with being able to learn how to use the potty on your own. Now that's also connected to our cognitive and emotional abilities as well, but it is primarily a fine motor skill, being able to hold your bladder for an extended period of time. So we see that the reflexes related to our our palmar reflex are directly connected to the fine motor skills. So being able to grasp, other things like touching and drawing are important for our fine motor skills. We do see that around 8 months, this is when we can hold on to small objects in between our fingertips. So that manipulation of objects is important. So thinking about also when children might start feeding themselves or holding on to a spoon. It could even be that they're just picking up objects such as a Cheerio to put into their mouth on their own. We do also see that hand-eye coordination starts from about 7 to 9 months. And so this is directly connected to our perceptual development. And we also see again that depending on the caregiving and our cultural aspects, what is encouraged in terms of the reflexes being transitioned into potential skills for fine motor development. So for example, with feeding, are we encouraging feeding of children on their own, or do we typically feed food to our child during mealtime? We also see that around 18 months, this is when children can transfer one object from their hand to their other hand. We also see that there is preference around 2 years old for which hand children typically would like to use, so if they prefer left or right-handedness. We also see that they can scribble using big arm movements, and around 36 months they can start to turn pages of a book on their own, or they can engage using large puzzle pieces. So all different aspects of fine motor development come down to the manipulation of objects. All right, everyone, that's all I have for you for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.